I know things that Gandalf didn't know, things that Aragorn didn't know, things that no Lord of Gondor, no King of Rohan, no elven council in Rivendell or Lothlorien ever learned, because the only people who knew them were inside the correspondence of the Dark Lord, and the Dark Lord's correspondence was not something that survived the war in any readable form. Barad-dûr fell. The tower burned. The records went with it. Every letter, every directive, every report from every agent in every corner of Middle-earth, gone. All of it gone, except what lives in the memory of the people who carried it. I was one of those people. My name is Khamûl's shadow. That is not the name I was born with. It is the name I was given when I entered service, and it is the only name I will use here, because the name I was born with belongs to a family that still lives in the East, and I will not bring what I am about to say down on them. Khamûl's shadow. A messenger name. A name that meant I moved in the wake of the second of the Nazgûl, carrying his correspondence and Sauron's correspondence, traveling the roads between Barad-dûr and the far reaches of the Shadow's dominion. I did this for 19 years. I read everything I carried, and I am going to tell you what I read. But first, you need to understand how a man ends up in that service. Because it was not a single choice. It was never a single choice. It was 1,000 small ones, each of which seemed reasonable at the time, each of which led to the next, until the accumulated weight of them had carried me somewhere I could not have imagined standing when I took the first step. I was born in Rhûn, in the city of Carath, which does not appear on any map made west of the Misty Mountains, and which you have never heard of. It was a large city by the standards of the East, perhaps 40,000 people, built on the banks of a river that ran south from the Iron Hills and watered the plains around it. It was not a bad place to be born. Not a good one either. Just a place. A city with markets and craftsmen and administrators and soldiers and all the ordinary machinery of a settled community that has been in one location long enough to build institutions. The institutions of Carath were Sauron's. This is the thing that Westerners find difficult to understand, or they imagine the shadow as something that falls on places from outside, something that arrives and corrupts and changes what was there before. In the East, in places like Carath, the shadow had been there for so long that there was no before. The administrative structure of the city, the laws, the tax system, the military hierarchy, the trade routes, all of it had been shaped over centuries by the requirements of serving the Dark Lord. Not by fear exactly, by something more like habit, by the accumulated weight of a way of doing things that had been in place for so long that no one alive could remember it being different. My father was a courier. His father was a courier. The men of my family had carried messages through the eastern provinces for 3 generations. They were working for the administrative apparatus that served Sauron's interests in the region. They were not soldiers, not servants in any direct sense, just men who moved information from one place to another for pay, the way other men moved goods or built walls or raised crops. It was work. It paid adequately. It carried certain protections, because couriers who could not be trusted to deliver messages intact were useless, and so couriers were generally left alone by the various factions that made life complicated in the East. I entered the courier service at 17. It was not a difficult decision. It was barely a decision at all. It was simply the thing that men of my family did, the same way a blacksmith's son learns to work iron. My father trained me himself. The routes, the codes, the proper way to carry sealed correspondence so that the seals arrived unbroken, the proper responses to the various levels of authority you would encounter on the road, the rules of the service, which were few and absolute. Carry what you are given. Deliver it to whom you are told. Do not read it. Do not discuss it. Do not lose it under any circumstances, because the consequences of losing certain correspondence were things my father described once and did not need to describe twice. I followed these rules for 6 years, was promoted twice, which in the courier service meant I was trusted with more sensitive correspondence on longer routes. By the time I was 23, I was regularly carrying sealed documents between Karath and the larger administrative centers further west, closer to the mountains, to closer to the heart of the Shadow's operation in the region. The work was harder, the roads less safe, the documents I carried more carefully sealed, with marks I had learned to recognize as indicating their origin from increasingly significant sources. The first time I read a message I was not supposed to read was an accident. Genuinely. The seal on a letter had been damaged in transit, a crack in the wax that I had not caused, and that might have been there when it was given to me or might have happened on the road. I could not deliver a letter with a broken seal without reporting the damage, because a broken seal suggested the contents had been read or tampered with, and delivering such a letter unreported was a serious violation of the service's rules. Protocol required me to report the damage to my superior at the next station, which I intended to do, but the letter was in my hands, and the seal was already broken, and the contents were visible through the gap. I told myself I was checking whether the damage had affected the document itself, whether it was still legible and intact. This was a lie I constructed in the moment and half believed immediately. I read 3 lines before I stopped myself, resealed the letter as best I could with supplies from my pack, and continued to the next station and reported the damage exactly as protocol required. Those 3 lines stayed with me for weeks. I am not going to tell you what they said. Not yet. I am going to tell you that they were not what I expected. I had carried sealed correspondence for 6 years with a professional incuriosity that I had trained into myself deliberately, was because curiosity in this work was dangerous. But those 3 lines broke the incuriosity, because they suggested that the correspondence I had been carrying, the sealed letters I had treated as simply packages with words in them, rather than as communications between specific people about specific things, contained a picture of the world that I had never seen and had not known existed. I began, very carefully, to read. Not all at once. Not obviously. I did not start breaking seals. I was not a fool and I was not suicidal, and the consequences of being caught reading restricted correspondence in the service of the Shadow's administration were not ambiguous. But there are ways. If you are patient and careful and willing to take small risks over a long time, or to learn a great deal about the contents of correspondence without ever breaking a seal. Couriers talk to each other. We always had. On the roads, at the waystation inns where we stopped to change horses and sleep, in the waiting rooms of the administrative centers where we delivered and collected. We talked about the routes, about the conditions, about the officials we served and their habits and their moods. We talked, carefully, and in the established codes of our profession, about the nature of what we carried. Not the contents, the nature. Heavy correspondence between 2 specific centers meant something. A sudden increase in the frequency of messages between certain locations meant something. The appearance of new seal types, new designations, new routes that had not existed before, all of it meant something to people who were paying attention. I started paying attention. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone noticed. I simply began to file things, systematically, in the part of my mind that I discovered had been waiting for something to organize. I tracked patterns, which administrators were receiving increased correspondence from the West, which routes were being used more frequently, which seal designations appeared together, suggesting coordinated communication between specific parties. None of this required me to read anything. All of it told me things. And then I was promoted again, to the Western routes, and everything changed. The Western routes ran through the passes of the Ash Mountains and into the territories that bordered Mordor directly. Or the correspondence I carried on these routes was of a different order entirely from anything I had handled before. The seals were different. The materials were different. Heavier parchment, ink that seemed to resist light. The officials who sent and received this correspondence were different, higher, more careful. The kind of careful that comes not from following rules but from understanding consequences. And the frequency of damaged seals, I discovered, was higher on the Western routes than anywhere else I had worked. Not because the roads were worse, though they were, because the correspondence was older when it reached me, because it had passed through more hands, because the long chains of transmission that carried messages from the inner sanctum of the Shadow's operation outward to its far reaches meant that by the time a letter arrived at a relay station in the east, it had sometimes been traveling for weeks, and weeks of travel in difficult conditions was hard on wax seals. I became, over the following years, very skilled at assessing seal damage, at determining exactly how compromised a seal was, and what could be seen through the compromise without further violation, at reconstructing, from partial views of text through the damaged portions of seals, enough of the content to understand what the letter was about. This was painstaking work, slow. It required the kind of patience that I had, because I had grown up in a profession that required patience. And it required a particular quality of attention that I had, because I had always had it, and had simply never before had anything worth directing it toward. Over 4 years on the Western routes, I read, in this partial and careful way, perhaps 200 letters. Fragments, mostly. Enough of each to understand the subject without always understanding every detail. But 200 fragments, filed and organized and cross-referenced in my memory against everything else I knew, gave me something that I slowly began to understand was extraordinary. A partial map of Sauron's mind. Let me tell you what I learned. Let me tell you what the correspondence of the Dark Lord revealed about the nature of the power that held the East in its grip and was reaching always westward toward the kingdoms that thought themselves free. The first thing that surprised me was the tone. I had grown up in the Shadow's dominion. I had been taught in the way that people are taught things in such places without explicit instruction, but through the accumulated weight of cultural assumption that Sauron was beyond the concerns of ordinary minds, a will so vast and so certain that the question of whether he might be wrong about anything was not a question that formed naturally. He was the order of things, the correct arrangement of the world, the direction in which history moved. The letters did not read that way. They read like the correspondence of an administrator, an extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily intelligent administrator, but an administrator nonetheless, like someone managing a complex operation across vast distances with imperfect information and imperfect instruments. Someone who was frequently frustrated with the gap between what he intended and what his agents delivered. Someone who had plans that depended on contingencies he could not fully control, and who was, in the letters I read, often in the position of adjusting those plans in response to things that had not gone as expected. He was not omniscient. I had believed, without examining the belief, that he was. The letters revealed someone who was working with information that was often delayed, sometimes wrong, occasionally deliberately falsified by agents who were telling him what they thought he wanted to hear, rather than what was actually happening. He had mechanisms for detecting this, and the mechanisms were sophisticated, and the agents who tried to deceive him generally didn't try twice. But the mechanisms were not perfect. The information he was making decisions on was not perfect, and the decisions occasionally reflected that imperfection. The second thing that surprised me was the relationships. The Nazgûl, the 9 kings who had become wraiths, who were his most powerful servants, who embodied the terror of the shadow in a way that nothing else in Middle-earth could match. I had imagined, before I began reading, that his relationship with them was one of absolute command and absolute obedience, that they were instruments, extensions of his will, without independent character or significance beyond their function. They were not, or rather, they were that. But they were also more than that. And the more than that was complicated. He depended on them in ways that the letters made clear he was not comfortable with. The Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgûl, was not simply a tool. He was a general of extraordinary capability, and the letters I read that passed between them, or that referenced their relationship, showed someone who was valuable enough that Sauron moderated his tone when addressing him. Not warmly. Sauron's tone in correspondence was never warm, but with a precision that suggested awareness of the Witch King's importance and a care not to misuse him. And there was contempt. Not for the Witch King specifically, but for what they all were. The Nazgûl had been kings, men of power and ambition, and, in their original lives, genuine capability. The rings had reduced them to instruments, and Sauron knew this, and occasionally the letters revealed that he found it useful, but also, in some way that I struggled to interpret, unsatisfying. As if the corruption of great men into servile wraiths was a solution to a problem that he had wished could be solved differently. As if he would have preferred servants who were powerful and free and genuinely convinced of his cause, rather than enslaved and hollow and obedient only because they had no other option. This surprised me more than anything else I read. The idea that Sauron might have wanted something other than what he had built. That the architecture of domination might have been, in some corner of that vast and terrible mind, a compromise rather than an ideal. The third thing I learned was about fear. Not his fear of defeat in any simple sense. Not the fear of armies or of resistance, or of the military campaigns that were always turning against him somewhere on the edges of his dominion. Those things appeared in the correspondence as problems to be managed, never as sources of genuine alarm. He was confident, to a degree that went beyond arrogance into something like certainty, that the military dimension of his power was sufficient, that given time and resources, he could overwhelm any opposition the West could muster. What he feared was the ring, the one ring, which he had made and lost, and spent 3,000 years trying to recover. The letters that touched on this subject, and there were not many of them, because even in sealed correspondence he was careful about what he committed to parchment on this topic, were different in quality from everything else I read. Denser, more layered, the kind of writing that someone produces when they are thinking through something they cannot resolve, rather than communicating something they have decided. He feared the ring being used against him. This I understood from the fragments I read. He had put so much of himself into it, so much of his power and his will and his essential nature, that anyone who used it with sufficient strength of their own could potentially turn that power back on him. He had designed this as a trap for others. The possibility that it could become a trap for himself was one he returned to repeatedly in ways that suggested he had not fully worked out how to address it. There was a letter, a fragment of a letter, that I read on a cold morning in a way station 3 days west of Carath, in the 7th year of my service on the western routes, and I had access to perhaps 40% of it through a hairline crack in the seal. It was addressed to Khamûl, the second of the Nazgûl, my nominal superior in the chain of correspondence I served, and it contained a line that I have carried in my memory for the rest of my life. He wrote, in that flat, precise prose that characterized all his correspondence, the following: "The halflings of the Shire have been located. Khamûl will proceed immediately to their territory and recover what was lost. He will not fail in this. The alternative to his success is not considered." It was the last 4 words. The alternative is not considered. I had read enough of his correspondence by then to know his linguistic habits. He did not use that construction often, and every time he used it, I had noticed. It appeared in the context of something that he was afraid might happen. Not something he believed would happen. Something he could not afford to allow himself to believe might happen, and so he refused to consider it. And the refusal to consider it appeared in the correspondence as a fact, rather than as the act of will it actually was. He was afraid that Khamûl would fail, that someone would find the ring before his agents did, that the thing he had built his entire strategy around recovering would slip away from him again. And the fear was large enough that he could not write it plainly, even in sealed correspondence, even in a letter that would be read only by one of his most trusted servants. I sat in that way station for a long time after reading those 40% of words, right, understanding that the figure whose will shaped the world I had grown up in was afraid. Specifically, concretely afraid. Not of destruction, of losing something he needed and could not replace. I entered direct service 3 years after that. Let me be plain about this. What I have described so far, the reading of fragments through damaged seals, was a serious violation of my position that could have ended my life if discovered. What I did next was a deliberate choice to go further, for reasons that I will explain and that I do not offer as justification. Khamûl's administrative apparatus was looking for couriers with Western route experience who could be trusted with direct correspondence between Barad-dûr and the Nazgûl's various operational centers. I applied, was assessed, was accepted, and spent the next 12 years carrying sealed correspondence directly between the inner circle of the Shadow's operation and its far-flung agents and allies, with access that made everything I had managed to read before look like fragments from an incomplete text. Why did I do it? I have asked myself this question for the years since the war ended, and I am still not satisfied with any answer I have found. Partly it was what I had learned. Having read what I had read, having understood that the correspondence contained a picture of the world that I wanted to see in full, the decision to put myself in a position to see it felt almost logical. Partly it was that my alternative was to continue as a provincial courier in the eastern routes until I retired or died, and the western routes had made that seem insufficient in a way I could not unthink. Partly, and I say this with the clarity of someone who has spent years being honest with himself about things he would prefer not to be honest about, it was that I wanted to be closer to power. Even that power. Even knowing what it was. There is something in the proximity to significance, even terrible significance, that is harder to resist than it should be. I do not offer these as excuses. I offer them because you asked, in the way that anyone listening to this account is implicitly asking how a person ends up where I ended up. the answer is not a single moment of weakness or corruption. It is the accumulation of smaller decisions, each of which seemed manageable at the time, leading somewhere that would not have seemed manageable at the beginning. Tot in direct service, I read everything. Full letters, properly, in the course of my duties, rather than through damaged seals. I carried them. I knew their contents, because knowing their contents was necessary to navigate the complex protocols around delivery. And I was trusted with that knowledge because I had demonstrated over 10 years that I was reliable and discreet and would not misuse it. I misused it. Not operationally. I did not pass information to anyone, did not sell it or trade it or use it to advantage any faction. I simply filed it, all of it, in the archive that had been growing in my memory since those 3 lines through a broken seal in my 23rd year, as now organized and cross-referenced and extensive enough that I began to understand things about the war that was developing in the West that I do not think even the senior members of Sauron's administration understood fully. Let me tell you some of what I learned. Saruman's correspondence with Barad-dûr was more extensive than anyone in the West knew. He had been in communication with Sauron's agents for decades before his open declaration for the Shadow. Not as a servant, exactly, more as a negotiating party. He wanted the ring for himself and was willing to provide intelligence and strategic advice in exchange for what he believed was Sauron's implicit agreement to allow him to find it first. The letters, on both sides, were models of carefully maintained ambiguity. Saruman was not agreeing to serve. Sauron was not agreeing to share. Both of them believed they were managing the other. Both of them were right that they were being managed. The communications with the lords of Harad revealed a relationship built on a foundation of mutual contempt held in place by mutual necessity. The Haradrim were proud people with a long tradition of independence, and the letters from their lords made clear that they served the Shadow not from belief, but from calculation. They had looked at the alternatives and found them worse. The letters from Sauron's side made equally clear that he knew this and found them unreliable for exactly that reason, and had contingency plans for their defection that he hoped not to use, because using them would be expensive. The correspondence with the mouth of Sauron, his chief lieutenant and ambassador, was the most revealing of all, because the mouth was in a position to observe things directly that Sauron could only learn about through reports. His letters were long, detailed, precise. He wrote about Gondor with the clinical attention of someone who had studied it for years and had both a professional respect for its military traditions and a comprehensive analysis of its structural weaknesses. He wrote about Denethor with a particular kind of interest, noting the steward's use of the Palantir and the ways in which that use was being shaped without Denethor's awareness. The Palantir allowed Sauron to show Denethor exactly what Sauron wanted him to see. The mouth's reports described which visions had been deployed, what their effects had been, and how Denethor's strategic decisions had shifted in response. Reading those letters was like watching someone lose a game they did not know they were playing. The correspondence about Rohan was different in tone, less analytical, more frustrated. The Rohirrim were difficult to manipulate through the methods that worked on Gondor because they didn't have a Palantir, and because their social structure was less centralized. Corrupting a king's counselor, which had worked in Theoden's court through Grima Wormtongue, was a more fragile strategy than the Palantir approach because it depended on a single human agent whose reliability was limited. The letters about Wormtongue from Sauron's agents were not flattering. He was described as useful, but unstable, effective, but not fully trusted, a tool that was being used carefully because it showed signs of breaking. He did break, in the end, yet the letters predicted it. I knew the war was lost before the Battle of Pelennor Fields. before the siege of Minas Tirith, before Frodo entered Mordor. I knew it from the correspondence, which changed in a way that I had learned over 12 years of careful reading to interpret. The change was in frequency and in tone. The frequency of correspondence between Barad-dûr and the operational centers increased sharply in the period after the Fellowship of the Ring was known to have left Rivendell. This was expected. A major development warranted increased communication. What was not expected, or rather what was not the pattern I had come to associate with Sauron operating from a position of control, was the tone of that increased correspondence. It was reactive. For 12 years I had read correspondence that was, whatever else it was, fundamentally proactive. It initiated, it set terms, it established the frame within which other parties were expected to operate. Even when it was responding to setbacks, it did so from a position of setting the agenda for what happened next. The correspondence I was reading in the months after the Fellowship's departure from Rivendell was different. It was responding to things rather than initiating them, trying to determine what the Fellowship intended, where they were going, what they were carrying, and what they planned to do with it. He did not know about Frodo's mission. I want to be precise about this because it matters. He knew the ring had been found. He knew it had been at Rivendell. He knew the Fellowship had left with it. He did not know that the plan was to destroy it rather than use it. His strategic calculations, which the letters revealed with painful clarity, were all built on the assumption that whoever held the ring intended to use it. That the war was a contest over who would wield it. That the question was whether he would recover it before someone else learned to use it against him. The possibility that they would try to unmake it, destroy it, throw away the most powerful object in the history of the world rather than use it, was not a possibility he had seriously considered. The letters showed this. The intelligence assessments of the Fellowship's probable intentions, prepared by his most capable analysts and summarized in reports that I carried and read, did not include it as a scenario worth planning for, because it did not make sense to a mind like his, to a mind that had spent thousands of years accumulating power and building structures of control and bending the world toward his will. The idea that someone would look at ultimate power and choose to destroy it rather than use it was not something such a mind could fully believe. This was his blindness. The letters showed it with a clarity that I found, at the time, frightening rather than hopeful. Because I understood, reading those assessments, that the entire structure of his strategy was built on a foundation that was wrong, and wrong foundations do not become right simply because the structure built on them is magnificent. They fail at the critical moment, under the critical weight. The last correspondence I carried before the end was a directive to the forces at the Black Gate, was an order for the assault on the remaining armies of the West, confident in tone, certain of victory, built entirely on the assumption that the threat from the east, from the small number of creatures who had somehow gotten closer to Orodruin than his forces had been able to prevent, was a feint, a distraction, that no one would actually do it. He was wrong, in a way that his own letters, read carefully and in sequence over 12 years, had told me he would be wrong, because he could not imagine it. And what you cannot imagine, you cannot defend against. The tower fell. I was not in Mordor when it fell. I was on the eastern roads, carrying a dispatch that would never be delivered to a recipient who would never read it. I felt it, the way everyone in the Shadow Service felt it, as a sudden absence, a silence where there had always been a presence, like a sound you did not know you were hearing until it stopped, and the quiet it left behind was somehow louder than the sound had been. I have been asked, in the years since, whether I regret my service. This is a question that sounds simpler than it is. I regret specific things. I regret that the knowledge I accumulated and filed in my memory during those years was not used to help anyone. That I never found a way to get what I knew to the people who were fighting the war in the West, who were making decisions based on incomplete information that I could have completed. I told myself, in the years of my service, that there was no way to do this safely, or that any attempt to communicate with the West would have been discovered and would have ended my life and my ability to continue learning. This was probably true. It is also true that I did not try very hard to find a way. The learning itself had become the purpose. The archive in my memory had become its own justification. And I am not comfortable with that. I do not regret learning what I learned. I cannot regret it. What I know about the nature of power, about how vast and terrible intelligence operates in the world, about the gap between how domination presents itself and what it actually is, I cannot wish that ignorance back. It would be easier. It would also be less true. And I have always found, even when it was inconvenient, that I prefer true to easy. What I will tell you, what as a man who carried the Dark Lord's letters and read every word of them and filed them in memory and has spent the years since the war trying to understand what they meant, is this. Sauron was not what he appeared. What he appeared was invincible. What he was, in the privacy of his own correspondence, was someone managing an enormously complex operation with imperfect tools and imperfect information and a fundamental blind spot about the nature of the enemy he was facing. He could not imagine people who did not want power, could not model a strategy built on renunciation rather than acquisition, could not conceive of the possibility that the most important decision in the war would be made not by a king or a wizard or a general, but by a small creature in a dark place, choosing to let go of something rather than hold it. The letters showed this, showed a mind of extraordinary capability that was also, in one specific and fatal way, limited by its own nature, by what it had chosen to become over 3,000 years of accumulation and domination, and the careful construction of a self that was defined entirely by will and power, and the refusal of anything that looked like weakness. He had made himself into something that could not understand what defeated him, and he had written about it, carefully, in sealed letters that he believed would never be read by anyone who would understand what they revealed. I understood. I am old now. The name Khamûl's shadow is the name of someone I was a long time ago, and I am not sure how much of that person I still carry. I live quietly, in a place I will not name, among people who do not know what I was. I have never written any of this down before this telling. The archive in my memory, the 200 fragments and 12 years of full access, and everything I learned and cross-referenced and understood from all of it, I have kept it as what it was. Mine. Not a weapon, not a gift. Just the record of what I witnessed, which I have carried because I could not put it down, and because someone should know. Sauron is gone. The tower is dust. The servants scattered, or destroyed, or diminished into ordinary shadow without the great will that had given them form and purpose. The world the letters described is over, and the world that replaced it is something the letters never anticipated, because the letters were written by a mind that could not imagine its own defeat, and so could not imagine what would come after. Something came after. Something always does. The world is still here, still being tended, as someone once told a ranger in a hidden valley, in more places than anyone can see from where they stand. I delivered messages for Sauron. I read them all, and what they taught me, in the end, was not about the power of darkness. It was about its limits, about the specific, consequential, fatal limits of a mind that had chosen domination over understanding and had built, with all its extraordinary capability, something that could not see what was coming because it could not imagine what was coming. Power without imagination is a fortress with no roof, impressive from the outside, open to the sky. That is what I read in the letters. That is what I have carried. And that, finally, is what I am setting down.